Hello everyone, it's Mark with OriginalHumanGeek here, bringing you the first of many to come Halo lore videos. With Halo Infinite right around the corner, I wanted to get as much of the Halo story out there as possible, so without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into this video. Before we can dive into the stories of Halo, it's important to get the background of the game's leading characters, the Spartans, specifically Master Chief Petty Officer John 117. The Master Chief is a Spartan II, so before we learn of that program, the question looms, were there Spartan Is? Well, the answer is obviously yes. They date back about 200 years before the events of the Human Covenant War, conscripted by the newly formed UNSC as part of a project called Orion. The beginning of the Orion program dates back to the 23rd century when the newly formed UNSC began developing bioengineering protocols and experimenting with altering human soldiers. Led by Dr. Ritza Shepard, the Orion project began as an extension of something called the Blue Sky Projects. Although these performance-enhancing substances were very primitive and nowhere near as effective as the chemicals used to augment the soldiers of the Spartan programs, they did show promise and gave results and serve as the catalyst for future endeavors. The initial version of the Orion project was activated by the Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI, on April 13, 2321 to significantly increase the combat effectiveness of the Colonial Military Administration's, or CMA's, elite troops. The end goal was to improve the security of future colonies outside the Sol system. At least 5 operators were selected as test subjects, and for the experimental augmentations, although the project would be shut down due to poor early results, funding issues, poor personnel retention, and low reliability. The troopers were reintegrated back into active service. However, for reasons undisclosed by ONI, all 5 would die within the year, while key personnel of the Orion project were transferred to colonization missions or terraforming research. As the civil wars began to intensify in both the outer and inner colonies, the CMA found it difficult to hold on to their assets between the colonial rebellions and usurping by the UNSC. Using data supplied by ONI, the CMA secretly relaunched Orion in response to insurgent attacks in the colonies. The project began on January 29, 2491 with 65 test subjects. After completing their training, an additional 100 volunteers were accepted into the program. The first Orion deployment occurred on January 24, 2496 as part of Operation Charlemagne. During this operation, the full unit of Orion soldiers was deployed to recover the suborbital transit station over Eridanus II. This marked the only time where a full unit of operators was ever deployed throughout the entire program's existence. They completed the mission with only a single casualty and without being detected. In the same year, an Orion team was deployed as part of Operation Veritas, where they secured the non-official cover list of undercover secessionist Union operatives who were working in various high-level offices within the CMA. As the war against the insurrectionists continued to escalate, the UNSC escalated their counter-insurgent activities under Operation Trebuchet, created in response to the defector UNSC Marine Colonel Robert Watts. The Orions proved key in the fight against the rebel attacks across the colonies, taking down insurgents as soon as they cropped up. However, as time went on, the insurgent attacks became more effective and insurgent personnel more difficult to root out, and over the ensuing decades they became more organized and more difficult to combat. Bombings continued despite the best efforts of both regular military personnel and the Orion soldiers. Civilians became caught in the crossfire of these conflicts and casualties began to mount exponentially, adding fuel to the simmering hatred harbored against the UNSC by many colonists. This prompted the UNSC to recruit more soldiers to the Orion program, culminating in a peak roster of over 300 active personnel. Though the Orion operatives continued to prove their effectiveness, some of the older conscripts began to exhibit flaws which were passed off as natural defects or stress from the war. Many Orion candidates exhibited post-traumatic stress disorder or repressed insurgent sympathies. Some in the latter category refused to participate in the program post-augmentation and were incarcerated. Despite the nominal effectiveness of the Orion soldiers, the results of the Orion's abilities were falling short of the scientists' hopes. Because of the candidate's age and inadequate genetic screening for specific genetic sequences, the genetic modifications led to minimal improvement and the inserted immunosuppressants failed in most of the subjects. This caused irreversible genetic fragmentation and degenerative conditions in many of the Orion personnel. In 2502, Operation Kaleidoscope was put into action. Many Orion soldiers were deployed to neutralize insurgent strongholds, but one of the key goals was to eliminate Gerald Mulkey Ander, the leader of the Secessionist Union. On March 13, 2502, Ander was assassinated by Orion operative Corporal Avery Johnson. Yes, that Johnson. With Ander dead, the secessionist union fell apart, though his death did not deter those who wished to be free from the control of the UNSC, and only strengthened the resolve of the insurrectionist movements in the colonies. Although Kaleidoscope dealt a heavy blow to the insurgents, the overall strategy of the operation failed to pacify the colonies. Worse was the fact that some of the older Orion soldiers were beginning to develop severe side effects from their augmentations that ranged from physical to mental illness. Their performance was also continuing to decline in addition to the ineffective strategies the UNSC were using. Operation Tanglewood would be the last operation the Orions participated in. The Orion project was quietly deactivated in 2506, and the 165 surviving members were reassigned to other special operation units in the field. However, these soldiers often exhibited side effects as a result of their augmentations, and many members were discharged from the military as a result of mental instabilities. In order to ensure absolute secrecy, the side effects caused by the genetic augmentations were masked as a disease known as Boren's syndrome. However, many of the former Orion soldiers were also able to stay in active military service longer than most baseline humans, a feat exemplified by Johnson, who continued to serve in the field over 4 decades after the program's deactivation. Around 2510, Oni began to re-examine the Carver findings, a study which had warned of instability in the outer colonies years earlier. The report rationalized that the instability would continue to escalate, and unless drastic military measures were taken, would result in a massive war between the inner and outer colonies. Oni's own projections at that time and up to 2525 concluded the same as Dr. Carver's findings. Meanwhile, then 18-year-old civilian scientist Dr. Catherine Halsey had been improving upon Carver's report on her own. Her independent conclusions predicted an even darker future than Carver's model, with UNSC inaction against the rebel leadership resulting in a minimum of 30 years of war and 5 billion dead. The maximum was a conflict of indeterminate length, potentially leading to the downfall of human civilization. Halsey presented her results to Vice Admiral Michael Stanforth of ONI Section 3, finding that they had come to the same conclusions. Determined to prevent the predicted carnage, Halsey agreed to work for ONI, specifically Section 3's Special Projects Division, on creating a solution. Generation 2 of the Orion project was initiated in 2511 as the best possible solution to end the widespread insurgency that raged throughout the UNSC space. The project was created with several goals in mind. The first goal was to create a group of elite soldiers meant to subdue insurrections in their infancy without substantial military casualties. The second goal was to minimize civilian casualties and avert civil war. The third goal was to substantially reduce the cost of conventional means of pacification. Dr. Halsey's proposal for the project detailed radical changes from the original Orion in many different fields. The first and most controversial was the subjects themselves, who were selected by a gene candidate pool and must fit into a certain age restriction protocol. They must also have possessed superior physical and mental attributes. The trainees must be instilled with military value and the understanding of war, something that cannot be taught to enlisted soldiers. This narrowed the candidates down to children who would be raised and taught in the art of warfare and military values from a young age. Using such controversial means of creating a soldier meant that the project would have to be carried out in the highest form of secrecy. Though conventional body armor had protected soldiers for centuries, the Gen 2's project, a second radical change, involved integrating the subject with a new powered exoskeleton device designed to help keep its user safe and provide a powerful means of combating enemy forces. The drawback of this new armor is its requirement for augmenting the subject, effectively turning the participants into human guinea pigs. Despite the tremendous risk and the unethical means of creating new soldiers, Orion Generation 2 was greenlit by the top brass within ONI, who concluded that the lives that could be saved far outweighed the risks involved. The project was initially granted funding for 300 candidates, though funding was later reduced to half this number. By 2517, 150 suitable candidates had been identified through DNA gathered from the UNSC's Outer Colony vaccination program, though funding had been further reduced to support only half that number. 75 children, all around 6 years old and of both sexes, were kidnapped. In order to preserve the program's secrecy, the children were replaced by flash clones, which would die soon thereafter due to numerous medical complications associated with flash cloning an entire human being. Dr. Halsey's use of cloning, following the dissemination of information on the project to the rest of ONI, came to be regarded as one of the most controversial decisions involved with the program. In particular, The decision drew the anger of Admiral Margaret Perengoski, Commander-in-Chief of ONI, who interrogated Halsey after her capture and demanded to know her reasoning for the use of flash clones. Perengoski viewed the clones as unnecessary, maintaining that Halsey replaced the abductees with clones for personal moral reasons, believing she was giving the families closure and thus easing her own conscience. Halsey was not satisfied with the project's original name of Orion Project Generation 2. Thus, she renamed it out of personal preference, and as well to distance the project from the failures of Orion in the minds of the political and military bureaucrats who controlled the project's budget. In order to pay homage to the sacrifice of the Orion project, she chose to call the project SPARTAN-II. The SPARTAN-II candidates, after being abducted and sedated, were taken to the colony world Reach, and began their training under Chief Petty Officer Mendez. To marginalize the civilian lives they had once led, their call signs were a combination of their first names and a numbered service tag, with second names being discarded. The Spartans endured a great deal of hardship during their first years of training. They were placed into situations and drills that pushed their abilities to their very limit and beyond. Their hard training was complemented with high-level education, which included mathematics, science, physics, reading, writing, and military tactics. Although his training methodology was tough, even brutal and violent in some aspects, Chief Petty Officer Mendez always instilled discipline, honor, and respect into the Spartans. He taught the Spartans how to kill, but at the same time he taught them the difference between right and wrong. Mendez trained the Spartans until 25-25, when, at the age of 14, they would go through the toughest part of their training, the biological augmentation procedures, which would kill 30 of the 75 conscripted children and render 12 more who would wash out of the Spartan-II program paralyzed. Additionally, while the procedures were taking place, the subjects were unconscious, a state where they should have felt no pain. The Spartans felt enormous pain throughout the process, with each augmentation having its own type of pain. Subsequently, some of those which were adversely affected by the augmentation process went on to join ONI, while others were given an honorable or medical discharge, aside from the 33 which survived the procedures with no physiological deformities. The bodies of those candidates who died were placed in cryosuspension in the hope that they would someday be resurrected. At least some of the candidates who were crippled were eventually rehabilitated. To finish off today's video, here's a current list of all the known Spartan-IIs, including the ones that died during the augmentation procedures, and their current known whereabouts. Thanks for watching, everybody. I can't wait to bring more Halo lore videos to you in the near future, and in the meantime, go ahead and take a look at the other videos that some of my friends are going to be uploading to the channel as well. It's going to be a fantastic time working with everybody and reading all of your comments and getting all your suggestions. Don't forget that if you like the content that we dropped here today, to go ahead and subscribe to Original Human Geek, and to go ahead and click that bell notifications as well, so you get notified every time one of us puts out a new video. So that's going to do it for today, guys, and I will see you next time. Until then, this is Mark, signing off.